It was a sunny morning at City Hospital. Dr. John Smith walked down the quiet halls, checking on his patients. He was the most trusted doctor there. At 55 years old, with gray hair and friendly eyes, he looked exactly like the kind doctor everyone wanted. He had worked at City Hospital for over 20 years, and people loved him because he always worked extra hours and took good care of his patients. That morning, he first went to see Mary Wilson, a patient who had bad chest infection. She was getting better after staying in the hospital for a week. Her daughter Lisa sat next to her bed, looking at her phone while her mother slept. When Dr. Smith came in, Lisa gave him a tired smile. "Good morning, Lisa," he said quietly, looking at her mother's medical papers. "How did your mother sleep?" "Better than before," Lisa said, stretching in her chair. "The nurse told me her fever went down at midnight." Dr. Smith checked Mary's heart rate and breathing. Everything looked normal, but for a quick second his eyes showed something different. So quick that Lisa would later wonder if she had seen it at all. He took out a small bottle from his white coat pocket, saying it would help her mother breathe better. What nobody knew was that Dr. Smith had a dark secret. Every morning, he came to work early and spent time alone in his office. There, he made what he called his special medicine. But it wasn't medicine at all. It was poison that no one could find in normal tests. That same morning, Detective Jane Brown sat at her desk at the police station. She was looking at 3 files. 3 patients had died in the past month. All of them were getting better, but suddenly they died. The hospital said they died naturally, but something felt wrong to Jane. Before becoming a police detective, she had worked on ambulances, so she knew about medical cases. Her police partner, Detective Tom White, brought her coffee. "Are you still reading about those hospital deaths?" he asked. The doctor said everything was normal. Jane took a drink of coffee and said, "Something's wrong here, Tom. Look at this." She showed him the files. All 3 patients were getting better. They were all women around the same age, and they all died on Tuesday mornings. Tom looked at the files closely. "That's strange, but it could just be a chance." "Maybe," Jane said, but she felt there was more to it. "I'm going to City Hospital today. I want to talk to the workers there." The 2 detectives didn't know they were about to find something very scary. At that moment, Dr. Smith was writing Mary Wilson's name in a secret list he kept at home. A list that would later show how many people he had really hurt. Back in the hospital room, Lisa watched her mother sleep after Dr. Smith gave her the medicine. The machine next to the bed showed her mother's heart beating normally. But in just a few hours, that same machine would show something was very wrong, and this quiet morning would start a police case that would shock everyone in the city. Later that day, things at City Hospital changed quickly. Around lunchtime, the machines in Mary Wilson's room started beeping loudly. Lisa, who had just gone to get coffee, ran back when she heard nurses rushing into her mother's room. Mary was having trouble breathing, and her heart was beating too fast. Dr. Smith came running too. He looked worried as he checked Mary's heart and lungs. "Get the emergency cart," he shouted to the nurses. But inside, he wasn't worried at all. He had seen this happen many times before with his other patients. Susan, a young nurse who had worked at the hospital for 5 years, noticed something odd. She had seen 3 other patients get sick the same way in the past month. All of them had been getting better, just like Mary, and all of them had been Dr. Smith's patients. Susan started writing these things down in her small notebook, not knowing this information would later help solve the case. At the police station, Detective Jane Brown was looking through old hospital records. She found something interesting. More deaths had happened on Tuesday mornings in the past year. All the patients were middle-aged women, and all were Dr. Smith's patients. She wrote all the names down. Carol Roberts, Betty Thompson, Sarah Davis, and many more. "Tom," she called to her partner, "I think I found something big. Look at all these deaths. They're all connected to the same doctor." Detective Tom White walked over and looked at Jane's computer screen. "That's a lot of deaths," he said, his eyes getting wide. "Too many to be just bad luck." While the detectives were connecting the dots, Dr. Smith was in his office, writing in his small black notebook. He wrote down how much poison he had given Mary Wilson and what time he had given it. He had been keeping this secret record for years, writing down every patient he had poisoned. He thought he was too smart to get caught. After all, he had been doing this for so long, and no one had ever suspected anything. Back in Mary's room, the emergency team worked hard to save her life. Lisa stood in the corner, crying and watching as they tried to help her mother. Dr. Smith pretended to do everything he could to save Mary, but he knew exactly what was happening. Susan, the nurse, watched everything from the doorway. She saw how calm Dr. Smith seemed, even though everyone else was panicking. It didn't feel right to her. She added this to her notes, writing down the date, time, and everything she saw. At 2:45 p.m., Mary Wilson's heart stopped beating. The doctors tried to bring her back, but nothing worked. Dr. Smith put his hand on Lisa's shoulder and said he was sorry, but they had done everything they could. Lisa broke down crying, not understanding how her mother, who had been getting better, could die so suddenly. As Dr. Smith walked away from Mary's room, he didn't know that two important things were happening. Detective Jane Brown was on her way to City Hospital to ask questions, and Nurse Susan was looking at her notes, trying to decide if she should tell someone about what she had seen. The quiet halls of City Hospital were about to become the center of a big investigation, and Dr. Smith's perfect secret was starting to crack. Detective Jane Brown arrived at City Hospital just as they were taking Mary Wilson's body away. The hospital halls were quiet again, but there was sadness in the air. Jane saw Lisa sitting alone in the waiting room, still crying. She decided to talk to her first. "I'm very sorry about your mother," Jane said softly, sitting next to Lisa. "I'm Detective Brown. Can you tell me about your mother's last few days here?" Lisa wiped her eyes. "I don't understand what happened," she said. "Mom was getting better. Dr. Smith said she would go home soon. Then, this morning, he gave her some special medicine for her breathing. And a few hours later..." Lisa couldn't finish her sentence. Jane wrote everything down in her notebook. "Special medicine?" she asked. "Did Dr. Smith say what kind?" Before Lisa could answer, Nurse Susan walked by. She heard them talking and stopped. She had been carrying her notebook of notes all day, worried about what to do. When she saw the detective, she knew it was time to speak up. "Detective," Susan said quietly, "I think there's something you should know." In her office, Susan showed Jane her notebook. "I've been writing down strange things I've noticed," she explained. 4 patients in the past month, all getting better, then suddenly dying on Tuesday mornings. All of them were Dr. Smith's patients. Jane's heart beat faster as she read Susan's notes. This was exactly what she had been looking for. "Have you told anyone else about this?" she asked. Susan shook her head. "I was scared. Dr. Smith is so respected here. Nobody would believe anything bad about him." Meanwhile, Dr. Smith was in his office, not knowing about the detective or Susan's notebook. He was getting ready to go home, feeling proud that nobody had caught him again. He had done this 47 times now, and each time made him feel more powerful. He looked at his watch. Time to go home and add Mary Wilson's name to his special list. But something different happened that day. As Dr. Smith walked to his car, Detective Tom White was secretly following him. Tom watched as Dr. Smith stopped at a small house on Oak Street, far from his big home in the rich part of town. Dr. Smith looked around carefully before going inside. Tom called Jane. "Boss, you won't believe this. Our doctor has a secret house. What should I do?" "Watch him," Jane said. "I'm coming with a search warrant." Susan's notes and Lisa's statement about the special medicine were enough to convince the judge. Inside his secret house, Dr. Smith opened a hidden door in the floor. Under it was a small room filled with bottles, papers, and his special notebook. He started writing about Mary Wilson not hearing the police cars quietly parking outside. Just as he finished writing, there was a loud knock at the door. "Dr. John Smith, this is the police. We have a search warrant." Dr. Smith's face went white. He tried to close the hidden door, but it was too late. Detective Jane Brown and 4 police officers broke down the door. They found him standing over his open secret room, still holding his notebook of victims' names. "Dr. John Smith," Jane said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Wilson and—" She looked at his notebook, her eyes getting wide at all the names. Many others." As they put handcuffs on Dr. Smith, Nurse Susan was back at the hospital, telling other nurses what she had seen. Lisa was at home holding a picture of her mother, waiting for the detective to call with news. And in Dr. Smith's secret room, police officers were finding enough evidence to put him in prison for the rest of his life. The next morning, City Hospital was full of police officers and news reporters. Everyone was shocked to learn about Dr. Smith's arrest. Nurses and doctors who had worked with him for years couldn't believe what was happening. Some were crying, others were angry, and many were checking their old patient files, wondering if they had missed any signs. In the police station, Detective Jane Brown and Tom White were looking through everything they found in Dr. Smith's secret house. The hidden room had told them so much. There were small bottles of poison that looked just like regular medicine bottles. There were newspaper clippings about all the deaths, which Dr. Smith had saved like trophies. But the most important thing was his black notebook. "Look at this," Jane said, carefully turning the pages. He wrote down everything: names, dates, times, how much poison he gave each person. He even wrote why he chose them. She stopped at one page. He picked Mary Wilson because she reminded him of his mother, who died when he was young. Tom shook his head. 47 people, he said sadly. He killed 47 people, and we never knew. In another room, at the police station, Dr. Smith sat quietly in handcuffs. He hadn't said a word since his arrest, but his face changed when Detective Jane walked in with his notebook. "We found something interesting," Jane said, sitting across from him. "You kept perfect records of everyone you killed. Why did you do that?" For the first time, Dr. Smith smiled. It was a cold smile that made Jane feel uncomfortable. "Because I wanted to remember each one," he said. "I wanted to remember how it felt to have that power, to decide who lives and who dies." While this was happening, Nurse Susan was helping the police find more evidence at the hospital. She showed them where Dr. Smith kept his medicines and which cabinets he used. In his office, they found another hidden compartment behind his desk drawer. Inside were more bottles of poison and a list of patients he was planning to kill next. Lisa Wilson came to the police station that afternoon. She wanted to know why her mother had died. Detective Jane sat with her and gently explained what they had found. When Lisa heard about Dr. Smith's notebook and what he had written about her mother, she couldn't stop crying. "How could we trust him?" Lisa asked through her tears. "He seemed so kind, so caring. How could he do this?" News about Dr. Smith spread quickly through the city. More families of his victims started coming to the police station. They all had similar stories. Their loved ones had been getting better, then suddenly died after Dr. Smith gave them special medicine. At the hospital, reporters interviewed Nurse Susan. "I knew something was wrong," she told them. "I'm just sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Maybe I could have saved Mary Wilson. That evening, as the sun was setting, Detective Jane sat at her desk, looking at pictures of all 47 victims. She picked up her phone and started calling their families. They deserved to know the truth about how their loved ones died. Each call was hard to make, but she knew it would help the families finally understand what had really happened. In his jail cell, Dr. Smith sat on his bed, still smiling, that cold smile. He had finally been caught, but he didn't seem sorry. In fact, he looked proud of what he had done. The detectives didn't know it yet. But the reason for his smile would soon lead them to an even darker secret, one that would shock them even more than what they had already found. The next day, Detective Jane Brown couldn't sleep. Something about Dr. Smith's smile bothered her. She went to the police station early and started reading his notebook again. This time, she noticed something strange. There were small numbers written in the corners of some pages. They looked like bank account numbers. "Tom," she called her partner, "I think I found something. Look at these numbers." Detective Tom White came over with 2 cups of coffee. Together, they started checking the bank accounts. What they found made them both sit back in shock. Each victim had left money to the hospital in their will, and somehow that money had disappeared. At the same time, a young police officer was searching Dr. Smith's big house. In the basement, behind a painting, he found another hidden safe. Inside were papers showing that Dr. Smith had been stealing the money that dying patients left to the hospital. He had taken millions of dollars over the years. "He didn't just kill them," Jane said, looking at the papers. "He chose patients who were planning to give money to the hospital. Then he killed them and stole their donations." They brought these new papers to Dr. Smith's jail cell. This time, he wasn't smiling anymore. "You found my safe," he said quietly. "I was wondering when you would find that." "Why did you do it?" Tom asked. "You were already a rich doctor. Why did you need to steal?" Dr. Smith leaned forward. "It wasn't about the money," he said. "It was about beating the system. Everyone thought I was such a good doctor, giving so much to the hospital, but I was actually taking everything for myself. It felt good to fool everyone." Meanwhile, at City Hospital, more terrible news was coming out. The hospital's money manager, Bill Parker, was found dead in his office. It looked like he had killed himself. He left a note saying he had helped Dr. Smith steal the money, and he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Lisa Wilson came back to the police station when she heard about the stolen money. She learned that her mother had planned to give $50,000 to the hospital's children's ward. Dr. Smith had killed her and taken that money just 2 hours after she signed her will. "My mom wanted to help sick children," Lisa cried. Instead, her money went to that evil man. Nurse Susan was helping the police again. She remembered seeing Dr. Smith with Bill Parker many times, always whispering in corners. "I thought they were talking about hospital business," she told Jane. "I never imagined they were planning all this." The police found more than just stolen money. They discovered that Dr. Smith had bought 5 houses, 3 boats, and many expensive cars with the stolen money. He had hidden everything under fake names. He had even started a fake charity that he used to hide the money he stole. That evening, Detective Jane sat with all the families of Dr. Smith's victims in the police station's big meeting room. She explained everything: the murders, the stolen money, and the fake charity. Many people cried, some got angry, but all of them wanted justice. As night fell, Dr. Smith sat in his cell, no longer smiling. His perfect plan had fallen apart, but there was still one more secret he was keeping, one that would come out during his trial and change everything they thought they knew about him. 1 month later, Dr. Smith's trial began. The courthouse was packed with families of his victims, reporters, and curious people from the city. Detective Jane Brown sat in the front row, watching Dr. Smith as he came into the courtroom in handcuffs. He looked different now. His gray hair was messy, and his friendly smile was gone. Just before the trial started, a woman with red hair walked into the courtroom. Her name was Rachel Green, and she worked at another hospital in a different city. When Detective Jane saw her, she knew something big was about to happen. "That's not his real name," Rachel told the court, pointing at Dr. Smith. 20 years ago, he worked at our hospital under the name Dr. David Jones. 5 patients died mysteriously back then. Then one day, he disappeared. When I saw his picture on the news, I knew it was the same man. The whole courtroom got loud with whispers. Dr. Smith, or Dr. Jones, just sat there, looking at his hands. Detective Jane quickly called the other hospital and found out the truth. Before he was Dr. Smith, he had killed 5 more people and stolen their money too. Then he changed his name and started working at City Hospital. Nurse Susan was called to tell her story next. She showed everyone her notebook and explained how she noticed something wrong. "If I had only spoken up sooner," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I was afraid nobody would believe me because everyone loved Dr. Smith so much." Lisa Wilson spoke too. She told the court about her mother's last day, about the special medicine Dr. Smith had given her. "My mother trusted him," she said. "We all trusted him. He betrayed that trust in the worst way possible." During lunch break, Detective Jane got an urgent call. The police had found something in Dr. Smith's secret house that they missed before. A small camera. On it were videos of him talking to himself after each murder. In the videos, he bragged about how smart he was and how no one would ever catch him. When they played these videos in court, many people had to leave the room. They couldn't bear to watch Dr. Smith laugh about killing their loved ones. Even the judge looked sick. "I did it because I could," Dr. Smith said in one video, smiling at the camera. "It's like playing God. They all thought I was there to save them. But I was really choosing who would die. The money was just a bonus." The biggest surprise came when they found out why he started killing. In the last video, drunk and talking to himself, he told the real story. His mother had been sick when he was young, and a doctor gave her the wrong medicine, killing her. Instead of wanting to save people, he became angry and wanted to hurt them, just like that doctor had hurt his mother. "But you became worse than that doctor," Detective Jane said when she questioned him in court. "That doctor made a mistake. You chose to kill people on purpose." As the day ended, the judge looked at all the evidence: the notebook, the stolen money, the videos, and the deaths at the other hospital. Dr. Smith's perfect mask had completely fallen away. Now, everyone could see him for what he really was. Not the kind doctor they thought they knew, but a cruel man who had fooled them all for years. But the trial wasn't over yet. There was still one more witness to hear from. Someone from Dr. Smith's past who knew his darkest secret of all. The next morning, an old woman in a wheelchair was brought into the courtroom. Her name was Helen Parker, and she was Bill Parker's mother. But that wasn't why she was there. She had worked as a nurse 40 years ago at the same hospital where Dr. Smith's mother died. When Dr. Smith saw her, his face turned white. For the first time since his arrest, he looked scared. "I remember that day clearly," Helen said in a shaky voice. "I was there when young John Smith's mother died. But the doctor didn't make a mistake like John told everyone. I saw John, who was 15 then, switch his mother's medicine bottles. He killed his own mother." The courtroom went completely silent. Detective Jane looked at Dr. Smith, who was now shaking in his chair. The truth was finally coming out. Helen continued her story, tears running down her face. I saw him do it, but nobody would believe me. They all said I was confused. John's father was rich and powerful. He paid people to say it was the doctor's mistake. A month later, I was fired from my job. And that's why my son Bill helped him steal the money, Helen said, looking straight at Dr. Smith. Because you threatened to tell everyone that his mother was crazy if he didn't help you. You blackmailed my son until he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Dr. Smith suddenly stood up, his handcuffs rattling. She's lying, he shouted. But his face told everyone that Helen was telling the truth. Detective Jane quickly went through Dr. Smith's notebook again. Now things made more sense. He always killed his victims on Tuesdays, the same day his mother had died. He gave them all the same type of poison he had used on his mother. He hadn't become a doctor to help people or even just to kill them. He had become a doctor to keep doing what he had first done as a teenager. Nurse Susan started crying when she heard this. She remembered all the times Dr. Smith had talked about his poor mother, how her death had made him want to become a doctor. Everything had been a lie. Lisa Wilson stood up in the courtroom. You didn't just kill our loved ones, she said loudly. You enjoyed it. You've been enjoying it since you were 15 years old. The judge had to call for order as people in the courtroom started shouting at Dr. Smith. Even his lawyer looked shocked and disgusted. During the lunch break, Detective Jane found Tom in the hallway. This explains why he kept all those records, she said. He wasn't just keeping track of his victims. He was reliving each kill, just like he relived killing his mother. Meanwhile, reporters outside the courthouse were telling the world about Dr. Smith's darkest secret. Headlines flashed across TV screens. Trusted doctor's first victim was his own mother. People who had defended him before now turned against him completely. Back in the courtroom, Dr. Smith finally stopped pretending. He looked at Helen Parker and spoke in a cold voice that sent chills through everyone in the room. Yes, I killed my mother, he said. She was my first, and she taught me how easy it was. How simple it is to end a life while pretending to save it. I became a doctor because it was the perfect cover. Who suspects a doctor when old or sick people die? As the day ended, the judge called a break until the next morning. But everyone already knew what was going to happen. Dr. Smith had finally shown his true face to the world. Now it was time for him to pay for his crimes. All of them, starting with his mother's murder 40 years ago. The next day was time for the jury to decide Dr. Smith's punishment. Everyone knew it would be a quick decision. The jury had heard about the 47 murders at City Hospital, the 5 deaths at the other hospital, and now his own mother's murder. They only needed 2 hours to make up their minds. When the jury came back, the main jury member stood up. Her hands were shaking as she read their decision. We find Dr. John Smith guilty of all charges, she said. Guilty of 53 murders, stealing millions of dollars, and lying about who he really was. The judge looked at Dr. Smith with angry eyes. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, he said. You will never be free again. You took advantage of people when they were sick and helpless. You killed your own mother. You are the worst kind of criminal, one who pretends to help while actually hurting people. Dr. Smith didn't look sorry at all. Instead, he smiled that cold smile one last time. You'll never find them all, he said quietly. But everyone in the courtroom heard him. There were more, many more. Detective Jane's heart stopped when she heard this. She looked at Tom, and they both knew their work wasn't over. How many other hospitals had he worked at? How many other names had he used? How many other families were out there who didn't know the truth about how their loved ones died? Lisa Wilson watched as they took Dr. Smith away in handcuffs. She was holding a picture of her mother. "At least we know the truth now," she said to Detective Jane. "At least he can't hurt anyone else." Nurse Susan was crying quietly in her seat. She had brought all the families together to support each other. They were planning to start a group to help other families who had lost people because of bad doctors. They would call it Mary Wilson's Hope Group, after Lisa's mother. Helen Parker, still in her wheelchair, watched Dr. Smith leave. "Finally," she whispered. "Finally, someone believed me." Detective Jane held her hand, feeling sorry that this old woman had carried this terrible secret for 40 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters were everywhere. They all wanted to talk to Detective Jane and Nurse Susan. "How did you catch him?" they kept asking. "How did you know something was wrong?" "We caught him because someone was brave enough to speak up," Jane said, looking at Susan. "Sometimes the biggest crimes are stopped because one person notices something wrong and tells someone about it." That evening, Detective Jane and Tom sat in their office, looking at a big map. They had put red pins in all the places where they knew Dr. Smith had worked, but there were many empty spaces, many years they didn't know about. "We'll find them," Tom said. "We'll find all of his victims. Every family deserves to know the truth." In his prison cell, Dr. Smith was writing in a new notebook. The guards couldn't see what he was writing, but they would soon find out. He was making a list of all his other victims, not because he felt guilty, but because he wanted everyone to know just how clever he had been. Meanwhile, at City Hospital, things were starting to change. They put up a wall with pictures of all Dr. Smith's known victims. They started new rules about checking medicines and watching doctors more carefully. They wanted to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. But for Detective Jane, there was no rest yet. Tomorrow she would start looking for Dr. Smith's other victims. The case wasn't over. It was just beginning again in a different way. 6 months had passed since Dr. Smith went to prison. Detective Jane Brown hadn't taken a single day off. Every morning, she came to work early and looked at new files. Letters kept coming in from families all over the country who thought Dr. Smith might have killed their loved ones too. One morning, a letter came that changed everything. It was from a prison guard who had been watching Dr. Smith. "He talks in his sleep," the guard wrote. "He keeps saying something about a garden and roses. Last night he said, 'They're all under the roses.'" Detective Jane and Tom rushed to Dr. Smith's big house again. In the backyard, there was a beautiful rose garden. He was so proud of these roses, the house cleaner told them. He spent every Sunday taking care of them. Nobody was allowed to help him. The police brought in dogs and special tools. What they found under the rose garden made everyone sick. Dr. Smith had buried all his secret papers there in waterproof boxes. There were more notebooks, more lists of names, and pictures of his victims. He had kept everything. 30 more names, Jane said, reading through the papers. 30 more families who don't know the truth. The new notebooks showed that Dr. Smith had worked at 5 other hospitals using different names. Every time people started getting suspicious, he would move to a new place and change his name. Lisa Wilson was still running the support group with Nurse Susan. When they heard about the new victims, they opened their group to more families. "My mom would want us to help everyone," Lisa said. The group had grown very big, with hundreds of members now. At his prison, Dr. Smith was still acting proud of what he had done. He told the prison doctor, "Those roses grew so beautiful because of what was feeding them." He seemed happy that his final secret had been found. He wanted everyone to know just how many people he had really killed. Detective Jane visited Helen Parker at her home. The old nurse was looking better now. "I knew there were more," Helen said. "A person that evil doesn't just kill a few people and stop." He couldn't stop. It was like a sickness in him that kept growing. The news about the Rose Garden and the 30 new victims was all over TV again. More families came forward. Some had lost loved ones 20 years ago. They had always wondered what really happened, and now they knew. City Hospital decided to tear down Dr. Smith's old office and make it into a memorial garden for his victims. But they wouldn't plant roses. Instead, they planted white lilies, flowers that meant peace and remembrance. Nurse Susan helped design the memorial garden. She put up a sign that said, "Never be afraid to speak up." Under it, she placed her old notebook, the one that helped catch Dr. Smith, in a glass case. She wanted to remind other nurses to trust their feelings when something seemed wrong. One evening, Detective Jane sat at her desk, looking at all the files, old and new. The total number of Dr. Smith's victims had grown to 83. Each file had a name, a face, and a family who had trusted him. She picked up her phone and started making calls again. More families needed to know the truth. In his cell, Dr. Smith had stopped writing in his notebook. He had nothing left to hide, but he still smiled that cold smile when new detectives came to ask him questions. He liked that people would remember him as the doctor who fooled everyone for so long. But what Dr. Smith didn't understand was that people wouldn't remember him. They would remember his victims, their stories, and how a brave nurse and a determined detective finally stopped him. His name would fade away, but the memory of the lives he took would live on in the memorial garden, in the support group, and in the new hospital rules that would protect future patients. 1 year had passed since they found the secrets in the Rose Garden. Detective Jane Brown stood in City Hospital's new memorial garden looking at the white lilies. Today was the opening ceremony. Hundreds of people had come, families of victims, hospital workers, and people from the city who wanted to show they cared. Lisa Wilson was giving a speech. She stood strong at the front, holding a picture of her mother. "My mom wanted to help people," she said. "That's why she left money to the hospital. Today, we're using the money Dr. Smith stole, all the millions he took from his victims, to start something good. We're opening the Victims Family Support Center." The new center would be right next to the memorial garden. It would help families of patients check their doctors' backgrounds, watch for signs of medical crimes, and support each other. Lisa and Nurse Susan would run it together. Detective Jane had big news to share, too. After checking all Dr. Smith's secret papers, they had finally found every victim. The total number was 97 people, including his mother, the first victim. Each name was now carved on the memorial wall, and each family finally knew the truth. Helen Parker, the old nurse who had seen Dr. Smith kill his mother, was there in her wheelchair. She looked at the first name on the wall, Sarah Smith, Dr. Smith's mother. "I can finally stop feeling guilty," she said quietly. "I tried to tell people back then, but nobody would listen. Now everybody knows the truth." Nurse Susan's notebook was still in its glass case, but now it had company. Next to it were copies of Detective Jane's case files, pictures of the victims, and letters from their families. The display taught new nurses and doctors about what happened, so they would always be careful and speak up if they saw something wrong. In prison, Dr. Smith was no longer smiling. Nobody came to visit him anymore. Nobody wanted to hear his stories. He had wanted to be remembered as the clever doctor who fooled everyone, but instead, people were forgetting him. They remembered his victims instead. The ceremony ended with everyone placing white flowers near their loved ones' names on the wall. Lisa put her flower under her mother's name, Mary Wilson. Nurse Susan put one for Bill Parker, who had died because of Dr. Smith's blackmail. Detective Jane put flowers for all the victims whose families couldn't come. That evening, after everyone left, Detective Jane walked through the garden one last time. Tomorrow, she would start teaching at the police academy. She would tell new detectives about this case, teaching them to always listen when someone like Nurse Susan comes forward with worries. At the hospital, things had changed forever. Every medicine cabinet had a special lock. 2 nurses had to check each medicine before it was given to patients. Doctors couldn't work alone anymore. They always had to have someone watching. The hospital had learned its lesson in the hardest way. Lisa's support group had grown into a national organization. They helped people all over the country look out for signs of medical crimes. "My mom died because we trusted the wrong person," Lisa would tell them. "But her death helped save others by showing us we have to be careful, ask questions, and speak up when something seems wrong." The white lilies in the garden glowed softly in the evening light. On the wall, 97 names reminded everyone what had happened, but they also showed how one brave nurse who wrote in her notebook, one detective who wouldn't give up, and many families working together could stop even the most careful criminal. As night fell, the garden's lights came on, making the wall of names shine. Above them was a simple message: "In memory of those we lost and in honor of those who spoke up, may their stories help protect others." The most trusted doctor's poisonous secret was now a lesson that would save lives for years to come.